Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 282. Music literacy is more than pushing buttons. Among the most misunderstood, mischaracterized, and confusing topics that I discuss on this show a lot is literacy. What is it? What is it not? It's time to include a wider lens here, beyond vocal and elementary general classrooms, to include instrumental and really all forms of music education as we think about what it means to be musically literate. Instrumental music, of course, has its own pitfalls. I mostly discuss the choir classroom pitfalls related to teaching literacy in this show, but David Davis is an instrumental educator, so I brought him on to compare notes. We are rethinking music literacy in this conversation, going beyond button pushing, or as I call in choir, that's what David calls it in band, I call it in choir, being a passenger princess, following along, copying, etc. But I'm super excited that I finally found another music is a language, let's teach it like a language nerd. So any others out there, if you're out there, we have to unite. So let me know who you are. In this episode, we explore the core difference between technical skills and true music literacy. David's going to give us I think, a really solid definition of that later in the show, emphasizing how a holistic approach can transform music education. David Davis is an instrumental and elementary music educator who is trying to pivot from traditional practices that he learned, just like I'm doing. I'm trying to teach differently than I was taught. He's going to share insightful ideas on how to cultivate musicianship that is rooted in understanding the musical language that we are hearing, improvisation, and again, connection to language. Some of the key points are that technical proficiency on your instrument or with the voice is not the same as being literate. You can be very good at pushing the buttons. You can be very good at making a pretty noise with your mouth. It does not necessarily mean you are literate. This episode invites educators to critically examine how we teach and how we interpret concepts related to literacy. We're going to move beyond mere button pushing and passenger princessing to cultivate language fluency in music. So join us, stick around all the way to the end, and have your teaching practices possibly criticized. That's okay. Have your ideas stimulated, challenged. Head over to Choralosophy's Facebook page and you can tell us how dumb we are, or you can ask us questions, which is even better. We can continue the conversation there, or you can subscribe for free over at Substack, choralosophy.substack.com, and leave comments on blogs and other pieces there. Your music program or event deserves a platform that does it all, without the extra costs. With Ludus, you get seamless ticketing, built-in marketing, powerful fundraising, and volunteer management, where volunteers can sign up, schedule shifts, and track hours with ease. Need to sell merchandise and concessions in person? Ludus Retail lets you log sales by each group, track inventory, keep everything organized. Hosting music lessons or theater camps? They have a classes feature, which makes registration and student tracking effortless. And it's free for your organization. Thousands of programs already trust Ludus because they help you focus on what matters most, the performance. Haven't already, I really think it's time for you to ditch the bulky sight reading books, the paper, all of the things that are already in the kids' folders in your classroom because it's not customizable to what they need in the moment. Sight Reading Factory allows this and so much more, including auto-assessment for at-home assignments, no more grading them individually. They can be graded in the moment. So use the Choralosophy checkout code, Choralosophy. When you check out, it'll give you a 10% discount every time you get a membership for yourself and for all of your students, which is really, really important so they can do this at home. A big shout out goes to the producers and Inner Circle over at the Patreon page. These are folks that are really dedicated to keeping the lights on here at this show. Venture Studios, Chandler Smith, Brian Long, Michael Herron, Kyle Peterson, Steve and Kathy Kakachik, David Kowalczyk, Max Jackson, Angie Schilling, Rebecca Chalk, RJ McCracken, Michael Shimp, and Kyle Siddons. All right, everybody, I'm here with David Davis. David is an instrumental educator from that side, from the dark side, so to speak, of music education. And we're going to be talking to him and comparing notes a little bit about what it means to be a truly holistically literate music student, and not just, as he says, on the band side being a button pusher, and as I say on the choir side, being a follower or passenger princess while reading. So David, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to have this conversation.
Yes, I'm excited, and when you reached out and emailed that you are also kind of pushing some of these same ideas within your spheres, it definitely was exciting, because I think it is rare and it needs to not be rare. I really think that we need to, as music educators, get outside of our bubble a little bit and go to some of these other areas of expertise. So we're definitely going to get into that and get to some of the good stuff here. But before we do, why don't you just tell everybody a little bit more about yourself? Where do you do what you do, and what do you do?
Yeah, so like you said, I'm an instrumental teacher. I grew up in the traditional band world. I'm also a general music teacher, so I teach K through 5 currently, but I've taught elementary through high school. I'm also a letters trained teacher. And for your listeners that might not know what that acronym stands for, it stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. So a lot of my classroom colleagues have had to take this letters training so that they know the science of reading as they're teaching English or Spanish. I work in a Spanish immersion school. And I volunteered to take it because I was really curious about the neuroscience of reading and how it might relate to music. And sure enough, the more I learned in that class, the more similarities I saw between verbal languages and learning music. So by no means am I an expert on the science of reading. I definitely did not grow up in that tradition, but I'm very curious about the neuroscience and how we could better help students by knowing what the research says. So I guess in a nutshell, I'm an educator that's all about growth for myself and my students. And I'm very focused on like systemic change and innovation in our field. I think I've heard you say before, it sometimes feels like we're really behind in our field when it comes to the research and adapting. And we tend to kind of hold on to outdated traditions in our field, I feel like. So I'm also on the NAFME Council for Innovation. I've worked with the Minnesota Department of Education on some music reforms, and I'm on a couple boards, including Minnesota's MEA and the Rock and Read, which is a nonprofit that has to do with bringing awareness to the brain science of like the connection between music and reading. I've heard you say in some of your other episodes is you've mentioned the Soul to Story podcast, and I just wanted to say that also like lit a huge light bulb for me when I heard that, because I feel like all the issues they talk about in that podcast are almost identical to some of the issues I see in our music field.
I'm so glad you said that, because I listened to that whole podcast basically just like talking out loud in my car in response, because they are the same issues. And if you're thinking about this question of how do we teach students to be literate in music, the same roadblock, so to speak, that our colleagues in other language areas of the school were going up against, that Emily Hanford did such a great job in that podcast of outlining those roadblocks and where they're coming from and why. I do believe that a lot of that is the same thing we are facing in the music education world. The problem is we don't really even know that it's a roadblock. So that's a huge difference. So yeah, I'm excited to dig into this question, because there are some really interesting parallels between the instrumental world and the band world related to this, and I want to get to those. But if you want to add something before I jump into your article, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, speaking of Soul to Story, it also feels like we have even bigger roadblocks than what they're talking about with verbal languages, in that our society seems to really care about kids learning verbal language correctly, but I don't think we're yet there. In the music world, like I feel like in general, our society is still okay with just the performance side of music, regardless of the means of how we get there. So I don't think we're yet at a point where many people care about music literacy. So that also feels like a bigger hurdle of like, okay, like the verbal language world is at least like talking about this and like, hey, maybe we should make some changes. And in the music world, I feel like we're not, like you said, we're not aware, we're not really talking about it. And I don't know how many people see the need for it yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I did in preparation of for this conversation is I read an article that you sent me, written by you. It was for the Yamaha music company's blog. And it was called Teach Holistic Music Literacy, Not Button Pushing. And it was an excellent article. Of course, I was hearing a lot of things echoed from the instrumental teacher's perspective that are things that I've been talking about till I was blue in the face here on the podcast for years. And I'm going to highlight a spot, since we've already talked about the science of reading connection and the science of reading parallels. There's a quote that you put in the article that goes like this. It's a quote by Louisa Moats. Children who learn to read well are sensitive to linguistic structure, recognize redundant patterns, and connect letter patterns with sounds, syllables, and meaningful word parts quickly, accurately, and unconsciously. Effective teaching of reading entails these concepts. And then you said, get ready for a hot take. which is this is why I'm highlighting it, because it's almost identical to the hot take that I've made on the choir side. A lot of sight reading happening out there isn't really reading at all. And then you make the point that the kids sometimes look like they're reading. They give off the impression of reading, but in reality, when they're looking at the music, they're not hearing music happening in their head when they look at it. They are decoding and figuring out where to put their fingers down, and then they blow, and then the music comes out. So in the choir version of that would be the choir teacher might sing them the line so they hear it, and then they look at it on the page and try to sing it back. And or the piano player is sitting at the piano playing all the notes for them, so as they're trying to read it, they're not hearing it first, they're hearing it from the piano player first and then echoing it back. And they look like they're reading in the sense that they're sitting there with their music, they're looking at it, but the music isn't coming from within their own brain out into the room. It's coming from somewhere else. In the band kid's case, it's coming from their instrument. In the choir kid's case, it's coming from the piano player. That's the parallel. So tell us a little bit about what you were trying to get at or communicate here in this article by making this connection.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I feel like, in summary, what I realized a few years ago is I now believe that literacy skills and technical skills are two different skill sets. And I feel like in the music education world, we often blend those together or talk over each other. So, for example, when someone says someone's literate, they might be referring to someone that can play their instrument really well. And I feel like that's not my definition of literacy. That's my definition of like technically proficient. And I found, as I've talked with especially instrumental teachers around these concepts, a lot of miscommunication, lots of misunderstanding. But I find that when I can find an analogy to the verbal language world, that sometimes gets people to be like, okay, now I see what you're saying. So I'll just offer an analogy that I found really useful when I was learning about this. I call it the typewriter analogy. So imagine if I had a typewriter in Russian, and I don't really know the Cyrillic alphabet, but I know that there's like P's with two slashes and upside down eyes and all these symbols that I don't know what they represent. And theoretically, if you put a children's book in Russian in front of me and asked me to just copy what I see, at first I would hunt and peck, but eventually I'd get pretty good at finding those symbols. And after doing that for 12 or so years, I could probably take Russian novels and type with pretty fast words per minute in Russian.
Right.
And just by doing that, I probably would still not be able to speak in Russian. I probably would not be able to understand people who speak in Russian. And I probably wouldn't be able to take those patterns of symbols and write my own book. I've only learned how to be a really good button pusher on that typewriter. So my technical skills as a Russian typist are really high, but my literacy skills in Russian are basically non-existent. If that's all I have.
You wouldn't be able to think in Russian.
Correct. Yeah.
Hear it.
Right. And that's also what I've learned from my letters training. When I talk with Spanish immersion teachers in my school, even speech pathologists, there's a difference between literacy and comprehension and fluency and technical skills. So that's what I was trying to get at in my article.
Right. And I think for anybody, I don't want to assume that anyone listening knows the kind of Edwin Gordon type terms like audiation. I think most people do if they listen to this show because I talk about it a lot, but just for somebody who's tuning in, just the idea that we can hear music happening in our head, but not only can we hear it happening in our head, we can identify it and talk about it and tell somebody what we heard. We can, and then we can reproduce it also because we see it on a page and we can hear it in our head and we can reproduce it all these different ways, kind of coming in and out every direction, every hole, so to speak, in our mind. So, for example, if I can hear, not only can I hear that little tune, I can also hear, oh, that's an outline of a major chord or, something like that. And do our students have that ability to have a conversation that is evidence that they are thinking in music? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And again, I think what's the analogy to the verbal world? So let's take this Spanish immersion school I work at. So K through 5, they have 6 years of Spanish immersion. And by the end of 5th grade, if they were taught well, most students at my school can speak Spanish, can read Spanish, can understand when Spanish is spoken to them, and probably even start to write their own things in Spanish. And that's because they've been immersed in like a sound before sight. It's everywhere. All their teachers are speaking it to them. They're expected to speak it back. And that seems very foreign to how I was taught as a saxophone kid growing up. My entire education from what I remember was just put sheet music in front of me and learn what buttons different symbols represent. So that's why I call that button pushing in my article, because I didn't actually learn how to speak music, which is improvising. I didn't actually learn how to write my own music, composing, and I definitely didn't learn how to audiate, which is like understanding and hearing the music in my head. In the same way that when I read a book in English, I can like hear the English words in my head and comprehend what I'm saying. But in music, like even as an adult, I still can't usually need to like play it on a piano or something and be like, oh, that's what it sounds like. So I feel like I'm still not really musically fluent because I didn't have that training as a child. And I feel like it gets harder to learn that as you get older. Not impossible, but harder.
For sure. Not impossible, but harder is right, I think. It's to continue the language immersion analogy. I think it's probably being at a Spanish immersion school, you would know this very intimately. But what is typical for American students, for example, who are going to take a foreign language is oftentimes they take their first introduction to that foreign language in like 8th grade or 7th grade. By that point, their synapses for acquiring new language by ear are almost sealed up shut. And what is notoriously bad, so to speak, about the American attempt to teach kids these other languages is that they almost never become fluent in them, number one. And number two, when they speak, they sound terrible. Like they sound like Americans because they're being taught the vocab, they're being taught to spell, they're being taught to read it off the page and understand what it means, but they don't ever learn what it sounds like. And you can spot them. And I had that experience because I learned French by ear as a kid. And so then I went to French class and I had an advantage because I knew what it was supposed to sound like. And I think that's, in some ways, that's what we're doing in music class also. We're teaching them the functionality of the music instrument and the voice and how to make the song happen, but not how to speak the language.
Yeah, and something I see a lot in the music education field that also I heard in my letters training is this mistaken belief that learning a language is a visual memory process. Then we just see symbols and we just kind of memorize. And that's how I was taught Spanish, of like, just memorize these words and then you'll be able to use them. But the more research I read, the more I'm learning that it's actually a sound-based approach. Like, that's why Spanish immersion, that sound before sight, start as young as you can, because that's how our brain just works on an auditory level before the symbols even start to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Now, another thing in your article that I found interesting, and I mentioned it at the beginning, but I want to dive into it, click and zoom in a little bit on this term that you're using called button pushers. And we've talked about it a little bit, but say more about why you chose that word because I don't take it as a mean-spirited criticism, but it is definitely a criticism of the band world, where you do see a lot of kids being taught to be button pushers. I call them passenger princesses. But what do you mean by button pushers, and how do you think it happens, and why do you think it happens? In other words, steelman your colleagues a little bit, and why is that so common?
Well, I think it's common because the system is built to reinforce the system, and it's really hard to innovate and do things differently than how we've done it for decades. And the system is currently set up to prioritize polished performance above almost anything else. So I'll go back to my typewriter analogy. If we were in a world where people only cared how fast I could type in Russian, then being trained to get as highest words per minute on my Russian typewriter as I can would be what teachers would train kids to do. What I realized is, like, I don't think that's actually what I want my band and orchestra kids to be learning from me, is just how to play their instruments fast with the right notes. I think I actually want them to be thinking in music as a language. Like, they can improvise without sheet music. They could hear music in their head. They would be able to identify major and minor just like in a split second, which is kind of even hard for me to do sometimes. In the same way that I'm improvising English right now with, like, it's not that hard to improvise English when I've been practicing my whole life improvising English. I can write English pretty good. I can understand English when people speak. So if it's possible for people to do that in English, I believe it's possible to do that in music. I think we sometimes call people that are literate in music prodigies, and I'm skeptical that that's the case. It'd be like my fifth graders who graduate fifth grade and are pretty fluent in Spanish. It'd be kind of silly to call them prodigies in Spanish. I think they just had a good Spanish education and they're fluent and literate in Spanish. And I believe that's possible in music if we were to teach music literacy and not just technical skills. I think the technical skills are a means It's like, okay, here's another analogy. If I was giving a speech, the most effective speeches are the ones that are really polished and charismatic, and those are technical skills. But that's different than literacy skills. I can be literate in English and not great at speech giving, and vice versa. I could be really good at giving a speech that I memorized by rote, and that's not the same as actually being literate in the language that I just gave that speech in. I think there are two different skill sets: technical skills and literacy skills. And especially in the instrumental world, I feel like we don't differentiate those two skills.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's an interesting thing, too, to compare across, because one of the things that I notice for vocal music students is, and this is where some of the main differences occur, is a singer cannot produce a pitch unless they are echoing it back or they hear it in their head first. Those are really the only two choices. And then, of course, when you're echoing it back, you hear it in your head because it's fresh. You just heard it, and you can echo it back in the same way that if I was speaking to a Russian speaker, for example, and they said a phrase to me, I could try to mimic the sound back. But that is like, but 20 minutes later, I probably couldn't, because I would have forgotten it, because I don't speak Russian. It would have had no context to me. So choir students frequently learn their part, and this is actually one of the most common things I hear and see on frustrated teachers' Facebook pages, where everybody's talking about, how do I get my kids to not keep just singing the part that is someone else's part. Well, and I'm like, well, because they're echoing back what their method of learning is. They're echoing back what they hear. And then as soon as other people start singing, then what they hear is the other people. And so they're going to sing the other person's part, because that's how you taught them to do it. And you didn't know that you did that. And so, but whereas say a piano student, they can play a G whether they know what a G sounds like or not.
Right.
My son on his clarinet can play an F whether he knows what an F sounds like or not. Ensemble trips can be more than just a performance. They can build community, inspire artistry, and give students a reason to stay invested. That's why I recommend Kaleidoscope Adventures. For more than 30 years, Kaleidoscope has helped student groups travel with purpose, combining performance opportunities with experiences that deepen musical understanding and create lifelong memories. They'll help you find the right destination, the right venue, and the right balance of music, education, and fun. And they manage the planning from start to finish so you can focus on your job as an educator. To explore options for your choir, visit mykatrip.com or find the link in the show notes. And this is where I want to get your take on this, because you had said earlier that one of the reasons that this happens is because we're so focused on the performance. Now, I don't know if this is a disagreement. I just want to know what you think, because I think that if music students were taught the way we're describing, the performances would be better, because they would be more in tune, they would be more rhythmically precise, there would be less following other ensemble members, we would have thinking, creative, fluent musicians playing and singing. So to me, I don't think the performance goal is the problem. I think it's the pedagogy itself is the problem. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with that. As someone who primarily teaches beginners, maybe it's like a long-term thing. Like if as a year one band student, if I'm still expected to give 2 or 3 concerts a year, and I feel like I'm going to get judged by my principal or the audience based on how these beginners sound. I remember feeling this early in my career of like, yeah, I want to teach literacy, but I just don't have time, because that concert's coming up in 3 weeks and we just got to be able to get through Pirate's Cave or whatever. So I think when I say performance, that's what I mean, is that just the being able to push the right buttons at the right time together, that's like the be all end all, because whether they're literate or not, the audience is going to think they're musical and they're good. So maybe it's a trade-off of like, what if we like pull back on some of the performance expectations, at least at the beginning? Because I agree with you that if they are actually literate and fluent in their language of music, that as they get older, yeah, those performances will be phenomenal. They'll probably play so much more in tune. There won't be such a thing as sight reading. It'll just be reading, because their brains will just know how to look at music and hear it in their head, and will keep their technical skills going with their literacy skills, so that they're able to take the comprehension they have and translate it onto another piece of equipment. So yeah, I think it's like a both and kind of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the way I would fill in some of that gap then, because you teach elementary school kids, I teach high school kids, but I teach also a lot of high school kids who are beginners, because in my school district, they don't get a lot of chance to sing until they get to high school. That's just the way our system is set up. They get very precious few opportunities to vocalize and verbalize, so to speak, to keep the language analogy going, the music that they hear. They do a lot of listening to Spotify, and they do maybe some every other day for 40 minutes kind of choir experiences in middle school, but they don't get that immersion that you really need to learn a language. And so I'm teaching beginners. However, um, the one little modification that I would make is if the music that they're being asked to play or sing is at their appropriate level for their age and their experience level and their growth along that curve, then the performances really can be excellent. I think even at the beginner level. I think one of the things that a lot of colleagues do is they over program. In other words, they give the kids music that they should not be playing or singing for their level. The way, and another analogy that I would pull out of this is let's say you've got fifth graders. They could probably be taught with enough repetition. They could probably be taught to perform a scene from a Shakespeare play, but that language would be way too advanced for their level of comprehension of the English language, and they could probably mimic it, but would they have the deep understanding that would be required for them to act that play out in a profound way that a 40-year-old actor could do? And yet we give kids repertoire that they can mimic back, but they lack the comprehension skills to do it. So I think if we are programming for their current linguistic level, then the performances truly can be artistically excellent. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And what I was thinking about as you were sharing is I think it was something I read in one of Gordon's books that, similar to verbal language, one of the best ways you can find evidence that people are comprehending and thinking in the language of music is improvising. Because you just said, like, the Shakespeare they could memorize, they could say it but not understand. And that's all kind of like rote education. Like, you can train people. Like, I don't speak French, but I think I could be trained to give a speech in French and say all the sounds correctly, and the whole time never know what I'm saying because I just practice the sounds. I think that's often how we teach music. We're just training kids to repeat back the correct sounds so it sounds like they're thinking musically. But then when we go to improvise, they just freeze and they get stuck. And that's kind of evidence that, like, okay, so their brains are actually not thinking musically because they're not able to speak this language. My Spanish immersion students, I can tell that they're thinking in Spanish when they can just improvise a spur-of-the-moment conversation in Spanish. Because, like, oh yeah, their brains must be thinking in Spanish because they're having a conversation right now.
Yeah. I'd never really thought of it that way, but the thing you just said about how it also can appear that they're thinking musically, just kind of like we talked about earlier, how sometimes it can appear that they're reading. They're mimicking the behavior of an adult who is reading. But in the case of musical expression, a lot of times they are just echoing our musical thoughts. As the teacher, as the conductor, we are giving them the thoughts to think, and then they are expressing them back because we've given them all the phrase shape, all of the dynamics, all of the nuances of everything, and they're responding back rather than demonstrating understanding of how those bits and pieces of the music should be put together. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize this is, again, my thinking that literacy skills and technical skills are two different skill sets. When students play really technically good, like I can play really technically good on a saxophone, that is not the same thing as comprehending and thinking in the musical language. I personally really, really struggle with improvising because my brain is so trained to, like, I look at a letter and it might be an A7 chord and my brain just goes play A. But, like, that's not what improvising is, right? Like, I shouldn't even need a chord symbol. I should just be able to hear what key we're in, and then hear when that shifts to a new key or a dominant key or a that's what, like, I'm pretty sure professional improvisers, they don't need any sheet music because their brain and ears are just hearing everything in real time in the same way that I'm hearing you speak English in real time and responding to you. So that's what I kind of agree with. I think it was Gordon saying that, like, the best evidence for comprehension in the language of music is improvising. And it's so strange that, like, I didn't even get taught any improvisation until high school. And even in high school, it was still put the sheet music in front and read the chord. So we're so focused on sheet music in the instrumental world, especially. And I feel like, what if we just focused on aural skills more? I think that would really help our students in our field become more literate in our language.
Yeah. Well, this might be a disagreement then, because I understand what you're saying, and obviously we share so many of these ideas about what kids should be able to do in their musical brains. But I think I'm going to push back a little bit and suggest that maybe you're misdiagnosing the problem when you get to the sheet music part. I don't think it's that we focus too much on the sheet music. I think it's that we teach the reading of the sheet music without all these things we're talking about. And that if if we were to do it holistically, kind of like you describe and like we've been describing, then the sheet music wouldn't be a barrier anymore. It would serve the function that it does when we are speaking English and writing and reading and communicating in English. It would be one of the many ways that we express our language. And right now, I don't think it's that we are focusing on the sheet music that's the problem. I think it's how we're teaching the sheet music to be just another source for them to mimic back without thinking. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And I'm wondering if that's kind of like stage two, because part of me feels like stage one is just the aural foundation. I think in some of your previous episodes, you've called it like your musical library, in the same way that like a child who's 1 or 2 is still building their mother tongue vocabulary by all the people talking around them, and they're trying to like start to say words. We wouldn't put a novel in front of that kid because their brains are not even ready to make the orthographic mapping connection of this symbol equals this sound because they're still learning the sounds. So I think similarly in the music world, especially because our society is not great at music immersion, and a lot of kids are not having well-rounded aural libraries. I wonder, so maybe more for me as an elementary teacher than you as a high school teacher, can I be building a vast aural library and start to show them the symbol correlations so that they're more ready for stage two, what you're talking about when they're middle high school, so that the sound symbol correlation is just so obvious to them. Whereas right now, I feel like our whole system's so broken that you're getting high school kids that are not fluent at all, and you're kind of having to do both at the same time. Do you
Right.
agree with that?
Yeah, no, yeah, that you're exactly right, and so I think that's just a nuance, and but I don't think it's like a semantic difference. I think because we do hear a lot of music educators, I guess, on the usually ones who identify themselves as progressive educators and or student-centered educators who in music who will say things like we focus too much on music reading. But then that's where the misunderstanding happens, I think. I don't think it is a focus too much on. I think it is a teaching it incorrectly thing. And then that leads to that other mythology that you mentioned at the beginning, that the kids who can read really well are these prodigies. As if you can't just, if we were teaching it in a way that wasn't preferential to those 1/3 or so of kids who will learn to read no matter how you teach them. I think because we're teaching it poorly as a we create these prodigies who we then lift up into these greater opportunities, and it creates all these inequities and kids that get all the opportunities for scholarships and solos and all these different things, and then everybody else quits music. I think that's really what's happening. For me, it's about the pedagogy, not about the notation specifically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, my belief is it's not if we should teach notation, it's when. So what I was trying to say earlier is I start with sound before sight, and then I'm always
Yep.
assessing, okay, I think their brains and their aural library is ready to start introducing the symbol correlations, but they need that aural library first. So I do think we're pretty aligned. It might just be a matter of when we start introducing symbols that maybe we disagree on, or maybe not.
Well, I don't think we probably do. I think, but there might be a nuance there too. So, for example, I don't think it's bad to introduce concepts of notation even to kindergartners. What I think is bad is when we start introducing notation for sounds that they don't yet have in their audio library. It's the overprogramming thing again. It's when we want to impress our principal. So we're going to have our kindergartners singing 3-part harmony, like with all these fancy patterns and all these different rhythmic things that just make them look so well trained, but then they're accessing a different part of their brain. They're simply mimicking back what we're teaching them to do. They're speaking Russian even though they don't speak Russian. And I think that's the issue. But I think that every kid, so this is kind of my little theory about this, is every kid who's raised in the Western Hemisphere, by the time they're 5 years old, by and large, would have certain basic musical concepts already stored in their music library, even when they arrive in kindergarten. And it would be major and minor. It would be 3/4 time and 4/4 time. If you're an Indian kid, you might even have 7/8 time. But our kids on this side of the world don't have that because it's in our folk music, it's in our pop music, it's in the mall in the background, it's in restaurants, it's everywhere. And so I think kindergartners are not too young to hear that looks like quarter note do, re, mi, and all those types of things. It's just that we shouldn't be using the notation to teach all this performance repertoire that they are not ready to read and understand. Does that it make sense?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're in agreement, and then there might just be finesse in the how do we go about doing
Sure.
that part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah, and I'm not an elementary school teacher, so I wouldn't even want to even get into how to proclaiming the nuances of how that should be delivered sequentially over the course of a whole school year. That's not my area of expertise. I'm just thinking of it linguistically in the same way that we wouldn't say a kindergartner is too young to be shown that the letter A sounds like and the letter B sounds like but that you also don't hand them Shakespeare.
Right. Yeah. If they already know, if they have that sound in their sound library, then I agree. Yes, now they're ready to make that symbol correlation.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And just I'm sitting here wondering, you as a high school teacher, like how much better would our field be if we all taught, like you're dealing with so much in high school that, in my opinion, should be addressed. Like, can you imagine? It's like you said with Spanish, when people start Spanish in like eighth or ninth grade, like trying to teach Spanish immersion that late, and just how much harder that is than actually starting at a really young age when the neuroscience and the synapses and I'm just sitting here thinking like how your job would look so different if your kids had music literacy from K through 8.
Right. Well, and this is one of my other beliefs too on the vocal side of things, that we get notoriously one of the biggest stresses that choir teachers in middle school and high school have is boys who can't match pitch. But I'm going to put can't match pitch in air quotes, because it's not that they can't match pitch. It's that they have not been ever asked to, as their voice grows, as the vocal mechanism itself goes through puberty and doubles in size, they've never been allowed the time that it takes to coordinate their muscles and sound out those sounds. Because of course that's where singing, for example, is different than speaking, where it matters what octave you're in when you're singing. When you're speaking, it doesn't really matter. You can convey the same linguistic idea in your soprano voice as you can when your voice drops, and it doesn't change the language. And kids need the opportunity to work that out, and it takes time, and they don't get that opportunity. So then by the time they're high school, we think they can't match pitch, but in reality, they just can't sing the pitches you want them to. And we label them as, oh, well, he just can't hear the music. Or, I talk to these kids sometimes and they're like, no, we can hear we're wrong. We just feel dumb.
Right.
It's not, I can't hear it.
Yeah. And then a barrier I'm thinking about in the instrumental world, maybe this is similar in choir, but by the time they're in high school, we've essentially kind of weeded out the kids that maybe had stronger aural skills. Well, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but the kids who have stayed in band and orchestra by high school are the ones who excelled in the technical skill button pushing side. So I've talked with high school teachers who are like maybe curious to try some of these like aural science or reading approaches, but they meet so much resistance from their students because their students have been trained. No, I just give me the sheet music. I just want to push the right buttons. So part of my thought process is like, how do we prevent the resistance of like the cycle just making the cycle?
Yes. Now that's interesting. That is really interesting. I've never thought of it that way. On the choir side of things, what I notice is that kids also have I call it an identity crisis when they get to high school, because at least where I am, because this is the first time that they have choir every day and they're being taught these musical language concepts, and they're being held accountable individually as they do, because I really believe that for singers, they need to do these things by themselves, or else they don't know for sure if they're just following someone. So I do a lot of individual work with kids so that they can develop these skills. Sometimes kids who have grown up singing beautifully, and especially from elementary school where they were the most brave singer and they had good facial expression when they sang, and everyone's been telling them they're cute and the best singer ever. And then they get to high school and suddenly it's hard for them. And they have this, a lot of times those kids want to quit. Like everyone else has told me that I'm an amazing singer, and I get to Mr. Muntz's class and I have to work hard all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, usually I can convince them that, no, actually, you are amazing. You're wonderful. But this is a skill you don't yet have. And so that's what we're going to work on, because I'm a teacher and I get paid to teach you stuff that you don't already know how to do. That's like the whole point. If you already knew how to do it, then you wouldn't need to take my class.
Yeah, I think changing to what we're talking about is going to be hard for everyone involved, mm-hmm. for teachers too. And when I think about like that heavy lift, I think where my thought process goes is we talk about lifelong musicianship, lifelong learning, and yet what I read and what I see is that oftentimes as soon as people graduate high school, they're just done with music, especially if they play like a band instrument. That instrument sits in their closet the rest of their life. And I wonder if part of that is because we're not actually teaching people to be literate in the language of music. And if we were indeed doing that, it maybe would be a lot easier for people to use their musical skills to just jam with friends or play at a cafe or write their own songs when they're feeling down. If all we're doing, especially as like band and orchestra teachers, is teaching button pushing, then yeah, as soon as they're not in a class that requires them to push buttons really fast, they probably feel like, well, I can't really do this anymore.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. Okay, I want to do something else out of your article here, which will bring us to a conversation I think that is also very important. We've been using the word literacy a lot, but I think we should try to define it. And you've got a portion in your article where you provide a definition. It says, what then is holistic music literacy? In your definition. And then you make the comparison, as we've been doing a lot so far in our conversation, to other written languages. But I don't want to spoil it. So why don't you tell folks, if you remember it, how did you define holistic music literacy in your article?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question because, like I said earlier, I feel like there's a lot of assumptions of what people mean when they say music literacy, miscommunication because of that, misunderstanding because of that. So I've learned in these conversations how important it is to define, hey, when I'm saying music literacy, this is what I mean. And what I've landed on right now is, again, an analogy to verbal languages. If we say someone is fluent in Spanish, we probably mean they can understand Spanish when it's spoken to them, they can speak it back, they can read in Spanish, and they can write in Spanish. So that's 4 areas that you need to say that person is literate and fluent in Spanish. I feel like if we agree in verbal languages that you need all 4, we should maybe also say the same thing for music. It's not just reading sheet music. That would only be 1 out of 4. And I would argue most people aren't even really reading with comprehension when they do that. That's my button pushing argument.
Right.
But to be fluent, it's not just reading, it's also speaking music, which is improvising, writing music, which is composing, and understanding music when it's spoken to you, which is audiating. So that's my current belief I'm functioning under, that we need all 4, and I'm trying my best to help my elementary students develop in all 4 areas, which might mean pulling back on a couple of the traditional performance expectations so that I have more time in my curriculum to work on the other ones. And my administrators in my current district are pretty supportive of that because our standards talk about all 4. It's not just perform.
Right. Yeah. Now, I think one of the areas that gets sticky for some people in this conversation is just the etymological concept around the word literacy. Because earlier you kind of intuitively used literate and fluent, literacy and fluency of the language. And I actually think those 2 words are important and shouldn't just be glossed over, because literally, literacy means read and write. It really only means those 2 things. And of course, the reason that word got invented in the first place was because all human spoken languages started as just aural. Writing came after speech. Everybody was speaking and fluently in their language, say, 50,000 years ago, before the writing that we now think of would exist today. And the reading and writing part got added as a technology later. And so the reason I like your term holistic music literacy is that the use of that word holistic, I think, brings in to the conversation the fluency and the literacy. But I do think it's important that educators understand that there is 2 different words and they mean 2 different things. So for example, if we're thinking about and this is the response I get a lot online when people criticize me for my advocacy of literacy, is, so are you saying somebody who is a great jazz player but doesn't read is not literate? And I would say, yes, they're not literate. But to me, that's not a bad thing. Like there's not a value judgment thing. So for example, they are speaking fluently in the language of music. They just haven't learned to read it and write it on a piece of paper. That's fine because they don't want to. But I'm a music teacher, and I'm going to try to teach the holistic language. I'm not making a value judgment to the club musician who didn't learn it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a prime example of the miscommunication. Like probably
Yes.
Whoever you're talking with online had a different definition of literacy than the one you just described. I know in the band and orchestra world, the definition I hear the most is being able to read sheet music. That's what's literacy. So the more accurate you can play sheet music on your instrument, that's evidence of how literate you are. And I would argue that's actually just technical skills. That's not even literacy.
Right, because there is no requirement, as we were talking before, that you are hearing that music in your head.
Right, I'm just
That
a
is
really
not-
good button pusher. Yeah, that's my whole article. Like just because I can push the correct buttons really accurately and really fast That's a different skill set than is my brain actually thinking in the musical language, which I
Right.
personally really struggle with because my whole band upbringing was all based on button pushing. I can
Yeah.
quote unquote sight read. You put saxophone music in front of me, I can probably play it pretty accurately my first try. But you ask me to improvise and I freeze up, or you ask me to sight transpose, like, oh, this is in the key of G, but can you just play it in the key of C sharp? Like, I know musicians who are like, oh, no problem, because their brain is like looking at those patterns and comprehending like the patterns and the musicality of it. So just putting in another key isn't that big of an issue. That's like someone translating English to Spanish. Like, if you're fluent in both, like, oh yeah, I can translate.
Right. Now, so this is a critical distinction, though, between these fixed pitch, I call them fixed pitch instruments, the ones where if you do the technical skills right, the note will be right, and singing. Because if I give a singer sheet music and no auditory support, like singing along, playing along, and they can read it accurately, that is evidence that they can hear it in their head. Because the way that, and that's where singing is a little bit, go back to Kodai, singing is a little bit different, and why he believed that it should be the foundation of all music education, because it has that's where it's the most neurologically close to reading and writing and speaking a language, is that if I can hear the sound in my head, I can verbalize it, is evidence that I'm hearing it correctly in my head. And I think that's where some of these things are a little bit different. And because I teach only a cappella, my pedagogy is based on this idea that if you can't hear it in your head, you can't sing it, so we're not going to get very far.
Yeah.
And so I'm forced to do these things.
And I would hope that we have a good number of instrumental teachers listening to this, because I'm sitting here hearing that and saying, wow, how much better of an instrumental teacher could I be if I knew what you knew and your approaches with singing. And I've started having my band and orchestra students sing before we play on instruments, but I'm kind of like figuring it out as I go, because again, I wasn't trained that way. I kind of understand the research behind it, but like, I'm just going to wing it. So if I had like your choir, like, okay, let me step back a bit, because what I'm essentially saying is I feel like it's so detrimental how siloed we are in our field, that we have the choir people, we have the band people, the general people, and we rarely talk together. And if we weren't so siloed and the choir people and the instrumental people like really collaborated, man, what we could do would be amazing.
You're exactly right. And I think it's tragic that there are band and orchestra kids being raised all the way through graduation of high school, having played their instruments for 5, 6, 7 years, whatever, and that will still say, well, I can't sing, because that means that they have never been asked to prove that they know the notes in their head. And that means they're missing out on so much.
And I've found that oftentimes those students that are technically good on their instrument but struggle with singing or audition tend to play really out of tune a lot. They really struggle with intonation. Yeah.
Because they don't know if it's right or wrong.
Right. Yeah. And that's how I was trained. Like, no, when I do this combination of buttons, it's right. I did not understand intonation until freshman year of college, when my saxophone professor like forced me to like, no, you need to learn what intonation is like. And the first time I heard the beating waves in my ear, I like was like, I hear that. I never heard that before. Like, oh, that's what tuning is.
Well, because kids have to be taught to listen.
Right.
That's a skill also. That's its own part of the process, that if they're not taught how to do it, then they're not going to focus in on it. It's like peripheral vision. You can see what's off to the side, but if you don't turn your head and focus on it, then you're not going to know many details, and our hearing works the same way.
Right. Yeah. To any listeners who are beginning instrumental teachers, they're probably very familiar with let's say Mary Had a Little Lamb, where the kids play an F natural instead of an F sharp, and they don't notice it at all. They think they played it totally correctly. And that's prime evidence that they're not thinking and hearing music as a language. They're just being a button pusher, because they didn't even hear that they played the wrong note.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one other area that I want to get to is notation systems, because I know you and I have talked a little bit before about some possible disagreements that we might have. I think as we're learning, the disagreements are less disagreements and more nuances of situation. But my belief is that the best way to teach this holistic literacy, which includes all of the 4 areas that we've been discussing, that standard notation or stick notation or whatever you'd like to call it, is the best way to do that, only because it's the best tool that it has been invented, because it has the clearest way to write the specific of what pitch is supposed to happen at what time for what duration. And I don't know of a system that would give a student access to as many specific musical sounds to be able to write down with clarity of any other system. However, I'm not married to that system, so if a new system was better, I wouldn't be opposed to it per se. And I also wouldn't be opposed to other musicians in other scenarios that are trying to learn other things, learning to read other forms of notation that are good for their scenario. Thoughts about that, and let's see if we can kind of uncover any possible disagreements here.
Yeah, I think what comes up for me is it's very culture, genre connected, related. And I think probably some of the disagreements you might have in this discussion is that our current United States music education system is so rooted in Eurocentric music. And I think there is an argument to be made that standard notation is a really good system for that style of music. But there's so many other cultures and genres of music out there. And I don't know if I would go so far as to say like standard notation is the best way. That, again, I'm going to, what's an analogy in the verbal world or the language world? That might be like saying, well, I believe English is a better system than hieroglyphics. And as a native English speaker, you might, well, obviously English, like it makes so much sense, but there's still validity to hieroglyphics, like the people that invented that and that can read that and decipher that. There's brilliance and knowledge behind that too. So in the musical world, someone who maybe doesn't know how to read standard notation, but is super quick at reading chord charts, chord symbols, that's something that I kind of struggle with. And like sometimes I wish I really could read chord charts a lot quicker. So yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is different genres, different cultures. I don't know if I would go so far as to say there's one best way.
Yeah. So when I say best way, I think what I really mean is the most thorough system. I think, and part of this might be my perspective as a choral musician, because only in standard notation could you get pretty darn close to recording down the music of almost every culture on the planet. You would have limitations, of course, when it comes to microtones. And there's people have been doing some really interesting experimentation of how to adjust modern notation or standard notation to include microtones and different symbols that you could use. But I don't know of another system that exists. And I've looked hard. That's why I say these things in public, because I've looked hard and I don't know of another system that gets anywhere in the ballpark of the thoroughness that it would require to write down all of the things that musicians can hear all across all cultures. And this is where I think the disconnect is for me and a lot of people, is that in my mind, notation is not an expression of culture. Notation is a technology. All notation, by the way, not just music notation, all of writing things down is a technology for storing information. That was the only reason anyone invented any kind of writing ever, was to store information. So to me, the value system is not cultural value. It's technological value. It's how much information can it store and how efficient is it in communicating that information to other people. And I just don't know of a more thorough system. And until someone shows me one, I think that's probably going to be my position.
Yeah, well, so I think I understand what you're saying. And again, verbal analogy. Would this be similar to someone who says, well, I think English is the best language for expressing ideas, so I think everyone in the world should learn English? Would you agree that like someone in Mongolia, they should learn English?
No. However, we don't read and write. Our notation system that we use to speak English is not English-based. So we read and write in a system that was invented by non-English speakers. And the notation system that we use of all the 26 letters, first of all, is not the same as it was 1,000 years ago. It's evolving and changing, just like standard notation is, by the way. As new sounds are being invented and discovered and spoken by humans, the letter shapes have changed over time to try to represent those sounds. And even now to this day, those same letters are being used to represent sounds in many more languages other than English. And because they are transferable, because they're more efficient. So for example, even on the Asian continent, you will see people trying to use the Latin, I would say Latin root, not English root, language letter symbols to phonetically spell out Chinese words, for example, because they know that they have a lot of people from other places other than China who speak all kinds of languages. What you don't see is trying to have Chinese characters used to spell out things phonetically for other languages, because Chinese characters were not designed to be phonetic. So to me, it's about whether or not the tool fits the purpose. And if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I agree with that statement. So then I'm trying to think of a musical example. Like one of the caveats you said earlier was like, it's your choir class. And I think that's a big distinction. What if next year you were assigned to teach a rap class? Do you feel like you would still use standard notation for all the music you're learning in your rap class?
So rap is rhythmic speech. So you would not need the 5-note staff, for example, because the 5 lines and 4 spaces staff, because the pitch specificity of a rap song, it does not require that tool. However, if my administrators were to come and ask me to teach a rap class, then unless I could teach holistic music literacy in that rap class, then I would say no, because I see that as my role. I actually would also then say I'm not qualified to teach a rap class. What kind of fraud would I have to be as a white guy from the suburban Midwest to teach a course on rapping? I might as well teach a course on chemistry. I'm not qualified to teach that. And so I guess that would be the way I would respond to that. I don't have a judgment about whether or not rappers write down their music on staff paper. That's not the purpose of it. But also music education has a different purpose than pop music does, I think. I think there's a different commercial music is a marketplace. A music classroom should not be
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. I feel like one thing that came up for me was a lot of what you're saying just seems rooted in the system of, well, this is what music education is. And you just said, well, I haven't been trained to teach rap, like I'm not qualified. Neither am I. And I feel like that's a commentary on our system. Like hip hop and rap is one of the biggest genres of music out there. And how can we be degreed in music education and know barely anything in that genre? I actually had the realization a couple years ago that a lot of the genres invented on our continent are not really centered in our education field. We're mostly centered on Western Eurocentric music. So Appalachian folk music, jazz music is usually not during the school day. Usually it's like 0 hour if it's done at all, or extracurricular. Rap and hip hop. Even country music, I don't know many school systems that focus on country music. So there's all these genres that are born of our own culture and our continent that we don't really center. So I think the notation discussion we're having, kind of a deeper level of this conversation, is acknowledging that tradition came from Europe and is used historically for European music. And I think there's a lot of genres and cultures out there where standard notation has not historically been used and is maybe not appropriate for that genre or culture. In the same way that there's verbal languages out there that don't have a written system. I think many of them do, or some of them, they've invented them. But I'm pretty sure there's some native languages, some tribal languages in Brazil and Africa where there is no written system. And then I would modify my holistic literacy argument to say, okay, then reading and writing that language is not part of holistic literacy for that language because there is no written and reading in that. To be holistically literate in that language, it's just speaking and understanding.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of that. I think my response, though, would have to be that it sounds like you're describing, and this is of course saying this with the utmost respect, you're describing utopia. In other words, there is no way that any one music teacher could become qualified in an entire lifetime to teach all the musics of the world. And that's not a commentary on the system, that's a commentary on the reality of finite time resources and mortality. We can't do all of those things. And the other thing I would say related to, the rap, let's go back to the rap example. For one, I'm a huge fan of 80s and 90s rap because that's the era that I was raised in. I am so thankful that music education has kept its, for the most part, dirty little paws off of hip hop, because I think we would ruin it. Not all music belongs in classrooms, and I don't think it's because not all music is good enough. I think that's the straw man argument, or it's not valuable enough. I think some music needs to be outside of school in organic folk traditions where we're not getting graded, we're not attached to a term, we're not attached to any tradition other than that oral tradition of I learned to play banjo hearing my grandma play it on the porch. I didn't go take banjo lessons and have to play for a jury and get the wrong answer, right answer. I think some music just needs to be organically passed down. And then classical music is a different thing, by the way, in all cultures. There's classical music in almost every culture too. there is that distinction between classical music. A teacher teaches it to you, and just organic in the community. And I think we need to preserve both of those. And part of that is that separation that's really important, where there's no right answer, wrong answer.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that I specifically use the term Eurocentric aesthetic and not classic, because I also agree that there's classical in lots of genres. And usually, at least in the United States, when we say classical, what we're actually referring to is Eurocentric classical music, like Baroque and Renaissance.
Now, of course, we're creeping into an entirely different podcast now.
Yeah. If I could just share maybe a final thought on this. I agree that it's unrealistic to think that an individual music teacher we can't be culturally omnipotent, but I do optimistically believe that our field could evolve where we collaborate together and we bring in more educators who don't look like you and me, because right now there's so many barriers and gatekeeping that keeps people that don't look like you and me out of the system. So I do believe we could evolve our music education field to give students a much more well-rounded cultural music experience. And I also want to push back a little bit on you saying that maybe not all genres belong in classrooms. I think I kind of hear what you're saying, that we don't want to stifle the creativity and the authenticity, which often happens in music education classrooms. But my asterisk to that is, I think that often happens because we're functioning under a Western Eurocentric aesthetic, and we take in a genre that's not that, and then we try to make it fit in that genre, and that's what ruins it. So my approach is I try to be as culturally responsive as I can. So I have students bring in the music that they already relate to, and I have them help co-teach with me. And I acknowledge right up front, guys, this is not a genre I know much about. Let's have Johnny help explain this genre because he's grown up with it. So I would argue that I think all genres belong in the music classroom, but they should not be done in the Western Eurocentric lens, which I think is our system is currently so many of us perceive music education through that lens, because that's what the system is built to reinforce. And I'm trying to I'm not saying that Western Eurocentric music is bad, but it's so inequitable. I'm trying to even out the playing field.
Right. Yeah. I would recommend, I actually wrote a blog about this exact thing. You can find it on my Substack, of how to think about the distinction between the pop genres and the folk genres and the classical genres, plural, because there are so many, and what role do they play? You might not agree with all of it, but I think that it's a more nuanced take than what we have time for today. Because this has been really fun, David. I appreciate this conversation because it's an important one. And hopefully we can get some people having similar conversations around their water coolers at school and make some changes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.